So, I have to take this. I think I can. That's going to bother the whole time. All right, so today I'm going to be talking with you about Antarctica, of all places in the world. But it really makes sense, right? East Texas, Antarctica, they really go together, don't they? But I want to start today's presentation by giving you a sense of the sort of place that I'm going to be talking about today. So I want to give you the first words of the first human being who ever encountered Antarctica. The British explorer, Captain James Cook. He writes of the Antarctic, "There is an inexpressible horrid aspect to this country. It is a country doomed by nature, never once to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, but to lie forever buried in everlasting snow and ice." And so the question I want to ask in relation to this is, what do we do with a place like that? How do we humans even make sense of it? Indeed, I'm going to suggest that the most important thing about Antarctica is that it is an alien world to humanity. In almost every sense of the word, this is true. You can think about our immediate physical encounter with the landscape, with its endless expanse of white desert plains and icy cliffs. It's totally different from our ordinary experience of a natural organic landscape. But secondly, also, just historically, it's simply an unknown world to humanity. It wasn't even discovered until the late 1700s. And for that reason, it has no native human culture, tradition, or history in every sense of the word. This is an alien world to humanity. And that quality of strangeness about the Antarctic makes it hard for humans to comprehend, yes, but I think it also gives it a unique power and significance. And so what I want to do today is look at some of the ways people have historically tried to visually make sense of the continent. And in this, I think we'll get a pretty good idea of the nature and some of the key characteristics of the Antarctic landscape itself. And then lastly, I want to bring all this together by using various artistic visions of the continent in order to answer what I think is really an all-important question for this subject, which is, what does the Antarctic mean to us? What does this distant world of ice mean to human beings? So that's where I'm going. But I want to start at the beginning of Antarctic history. And it's interesting, in some sense, it begins before the continent's even discovered. And what I mean by that is ancient thinkers like Aristotle and Ptolemy, they've intuited the existence of an unknown southern continent that must be there to balance out the northern ones. And this idea of an unknown southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita in Latin, became a prominent feature on many medieval and early modern maps. And so here we have it. Before humans have even physically encountered the continent, we've already got our first visual means for understanding this place through these maps. And because the maps are largely empty, it's unknown, it becomes a sort of blank slate upon which the Western imagination can take hold and project all these fantastic visions about it. It becomes associated with things like El Dorado, Atlantis, the gateway to the center of the earth. It's imagined it's a fertile land with millions of inhabitants, all these sorts of things. But even though today we've discovered the continent, we've encountered it, we have images of it, this visual mediation of the continent through these maps remains one of the most important ways that we in the distant world of civilization encounter the continent. And because it's still largely empty to this day, the map of Antarctica still retains some of that old enchantment that's characteristic of a blank space on the map, like Joseph Conrad described so well in The Heart of Darkness. To a large degree, that's still present. Oh boy. Okay. But in spite of this pre-contact notion of an unknown southern land, it's left to Captain Cook on his second world voyage to see what the deal is with this fabled southern land. And so he sails south. He sails far south. He goes below the Antarctic Circle, where he's forced to turn back due to the imposing Antarctic pack ice. And though he doesn't literally make sight of the continent, he's entered into the Antarctic environment. He's there. This is the first human first human being to experience this place. And what is his reaction? It fills him with horror. As I described at the beginning, this is a doomed land buried in everlasting snow and ice. What's interesting is you can compare this to the vision of other early explorers like James Clark Ross, who describes how him and his men were filled with feelings of inexpressible delight upon seeing a scene of grandeur and magnificence beyond anything they'd ever before seen or could have conceived. How can we make sense of this serious discrepancy between the two experiences of this one place? I think it has something to do with the romantic idea of the sublime. That is, something that's both beautiful and terrifying. It's both of these at the same time. It's so powerful, it transcends these categories. Perhaps that's why some, like theologian philosopher John Milbank, has said that this romantic idea of the sublime at this time was offered up as a sort of pseudo-transcendence to replace the loss of traditional faith in God during the modern era. But especially important for Romanticism was the idea of the sublime to be found in nature. And I think we can get a good image of that here in this Russian painting, The Ninth Wave. At once the sea is overwhelming and terrifying, and yet beautiful, definitely. We can also see it here in this painting, which is in fact the Dallas Museum of Art. And so here we have this idea that the polar regions, the ice worlds, even they can be a place for getting a glimpse of the sublime. But here we have the Arctic depicted, which is the northern place at the top of the globe. With Gustave Dor's illustrations, we get a sense that there can be a distinctively Antarctic sublime. And it's interesting because his vision of the Antarctic sees it as a sort of icy counterpart to his other famous illustrations for Dante's Inferno of hell. This is the icy underworld, literally. But another important way that humans have tried to make sense of this continent is by putting a human face on it. And so, at the beginning of the 20th century, we have perhaps the most important time in Antarctic history, this heroic age. And we have the great explorers like Robert Scott, Roald Amundsen, Ernest Shackleton. And I don't have time to tell all their fantastic stories, but the important thing is they sort of provide the Antarctic version of the heroes of ancient times. And so it's not surprising then that they find monumental tribute in not only the Antarctic, but also throughout the world. They're one of the most important means by which we've historically put a human face on the continent. But what's interesting is with this idea of the need to put a face on the inhuman Antarctic, that's also led us to use penguins. And so what we've often done is we've historically anthropomorphized penguins. We've made them into sort of the continent's distinctive native inhabitant. This is the native population of Antarctica. We need to put some sort of face on it, and so we humanize these penguins in order to compensate for the lack of an actual human presence. And it's kind of awesome, isn't it? But to get to the question of the artistic appropriation of Antarctica in a more traditional sense, so there's a number. It's interesting. The discovery of the continent did not elicit the same response by the artists to some of the other great lands that were revealed by exploration, like say the American West here. Yes, in the early expeditions, we do have illustrators that go with the explorers, but their purpose is not so much artistic as it is scientific, literally recording visual data. But one of the more practical reasons why we never see painting take hold in the Antarctic is the issue of freezing oil paints. And so that leads many to use chalk as a medium for the Antarctic. It also leads them, as you can see here, very interestingly, they would literally write in the colors of the scenes they sketched out on the continent so they can then paint them in an environment more favorable to painting. But historically, there's also another interesting reason for this. At this time I've been describing in the early 20th century, during this heroic age, the height of Antarctica's popularity in the world, this is precisely the moment when Western art is starting to move away from more traditional representational art. And so it was really bad timing. And there's a number of reasons for why that move happened, but one of the important reasons is that in terms of pure representation, traditional art could not compete with the new technology of the camera. And because of that, we see photography become the distinctive Antarctic art medium. And it's especially important during this climactic, heroic age of Antarctic history. And in this period, we get artists like Herbert Ponting here. And it's been said that he, as a photographer, struggled with how to make the brutal, desolate, inhuman Antarctic landscape into something interesting for photography. And so he was led on a quest for the picturesque, wherever he could find it or create it. It also led him to put human figures in his photographs to give them both a scale, to the place, but also add a little human interest to it. And it's funny because a lot of the explorers he traveled with even came up with a verb to describe this, to pont. That is, to stand in front of one of Ponting's photographies in order to give it a scale and perspective in the face of the immense ice cape. Another important photographer is Frank Hurley, who was with Shackleton on his ill-fated endurance expedition you may have heard of. But Hurley liked to emphasize the struggle of Antarctic existence, of exploration. And so I think we get a good image of that in this top right photograph of these men picking away at the ice during a blizzard in order to capture some of it so that they can then take it away and melt it into drinking water. This is the struggle inherent to Antarctic life, and he'd like to capture it. But then again, we also have more picturesque photos like adorable Adelie penguins in the bottom, so he does that too. But it's important at this time in Antarctic history, photography plays a key role because, like I said, this is whenever Antarctica is really getting a lot of attention by the world in this period. And so here we have it, right here, you're looking at it. Some of the first images the world, photographic images, the world gets of the Antarctic. And so these are very important. Historically, though, there's another reason why painting was never as big of a deal in the Antarctic. And I've been describing this historical period, the early 20th century, when Antarctica most needed the artist. That was also the time when many artists, for some of the reasons I've already mentioned, were looking to a more minimalist, reductionist sort of art. And so what they did was, they essentially looked to the Antarctic landscape in all of its emptiness, and they essentially said, there's nothing for us to do. Nature's already done it. And so here we have a famous example of this basic impulse in Western art at the time, and nude descending a staircase at the top, or in Piet Mondrian's simplified apple tree. And then on the right we have Kazimir Malevich of the Russian suprematist movement, his painting of pure abstract form, white on white. And so there's this, and then here's the vast majority of the Antarctic landscape. This is what most of the interior of the continent looks like. And so the question is, how do you reduce that? How do you do anything with that? And so that's really the problem that we're going to face for creating an Antarctic art. But I think this is a good point to go into another key feature of the Antarctic landscape. One of the most defining characteristics of it, which is nothing. It's emptiness. And that's related to this idea of the horror vacui. That is, the subjective human fear of the empty. And so, it's often said that nature abhors a vacuum, but with this idea of the horror vacui, we get the idea that humans also abhor a vacuum, emptiness. And this is related to our ingrained desire to fill up any blank space. And so, you can see this basic impulse also found in, say, the Book of Kells and other illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages, or the detailed arabesque of much Islamic art. Visually, blank space is the horror, so to speak, and it must be filled in at all costs. And so even when an artist rebels against this, they leave the space empty. There's a certain power to that as well. And so what we have in the Antarctic is a landscape that overwhelmingly embodies this principle of the Ford vacuum. But this idea of emptiness is also related to the aesthetic power of white. Very fitting for Antarctica, which has been called the white continent. And so Kandinsky, who's on white painting the scene here, he recognized this power of white. He said, we often consider white no color, but it's in fact a symbol of a world from which all colors as material attributes have disappeared. And this is great. It acts upon our psyche as a great absolute silence, like the pauses in music that temporarily break the melody. It is not a dead silence, but one pregnant with possibilities. White has the appeal of the nothingness that is before birth, of the world in the ice age. What a fitting metaphor. And so we also see this idea of the power of white in Herman Melville's Moby Dick with the white whale. Melville says of white, it is a dumb blankness, full of meaning, at once the most meaningful symbol of spiritual things, and yet the most appalling to mankind. Here once again is that romantic notion of the sublime as well. But even beyond humans' attempts to make sense of the landscape, we can see in some of these principles that the Antarctic land itself embodies these powerful aesthetic principles. And perhaps this even comes in the way that the later explorer Richard Byrd would describe it. He says, there's a great beauty to the Antarctic, yes, but it's in the way that things that are terrible can also be beautiful. And so to this point, I've said a lot about the Antarctic landscape, but I still have not answered the question of what this land, this distant Antarctic, could mean to us. And so, because most of us will probably never go to the continent, I think one of the most important impacts it could have is not only as a land in itself, but also in its potential to serve as a symbol calling us to higher visions of the world. And it's interesting because that's what many of the contemporary artists in Antarctica have envisioned it as. So like here we see on the right two images, the Antarctic Monument, which is a two-part work existing in both the northern and southern hemisphere. And in the British northern part of the monument, there's a concave center that's symbolically filled in the Antarctic southern portion of the monument. Here we have this idea that even the distant alien Antarctic is in fact a part of our human world. We can see this as well at Andrew Rogers' Rhythms of Life project on the left here. It's a series of pieces of ephemeral land art that's found on each continent, yet is symbolically concluded, consummated, we might say, in the Antarctic, which is seen as a sort of metaphorical symbol of the world as an interconnected whole. This idea is also present in the important work of Lita Albuquerque in Stellar Axis. It consists of a series of 99 blue spheres laid out across the ice in a pattern mirroring the greatest stars in the southern hemisphere. And what she's trying to witness to in this work is the reality of connection of Antarctica with the globe, like the other artists, yes, but also of man with nature, of the earth with the skies, of the individual with the infinite, the numinous, as she calls it, the transcendent. And so, like the other artists, she sees Antarctica as a starting place for realizing how interconnected everything is. But she also sees it as a place to remind us how small we are, including, as she puts it, the precarious nature of the human condition. And so she sees Antarctica as a starting point for these greater realizations about the world, both about who we are as human beings and also the nature of the world that we live in. And in all of this, I'm reminded of what the proto-surrealist Italian artist, Giorgio De Chirico, God help me, what he said about what he wanted his viewers to experience when they saw his early metaphysical works, this haunting dream world. He says he wanted them to have the experience, the feeling, to identify with the first man who walked the earth. They must have seen signs, omens everywhere, and thus trembled with every step. Perhaps there's a glory and majesty to the world that we've largely fallen asleep to. And perhaps it's our task to sort of wake up, to remember the world as it really is. And so I've described how distant and other, unique the Antarctic is, but perhaps this quality of strangeness that defines the Antarctic. It helped remind us of the strangeness and wonder in all existence. And in that, I'm sort of reminded of what C.S. Lewis said about fairy tales. It's not so much that they allow us to escape to some distant, enchanted forest. It's also that they allow us to see our own familiar forest as a bit enchanted. And so, perhaps in a similar way, the alien wonder of Antarctica can help remind us of the mystery and wonder that's present in this little world that we occupy. And so here we have it, Antarctica, with all of its visual power, including all the ways that I've suggested, the aesthetic power of light and emptiness, its embodiment of the romantic idea of the sublime, all these things. And then we have the historical attempts to make sense of this land. And it would seem that really these are ultimately attempts to tap into and express that unique power and significance that's inherent to this alien, strange world. And so I want to finish things up here by giving you the words of T.S. Eliot, which I think are really fitting for what I've been talking about and just for Antarctica in general. He says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Perhaps humans' great exploratory adventure at the bottom of the world in Antarctica, with all of its visual power, even if it's a terrible, awful kind of power, if I suggested. This bizarre, lonely world of ice and penguins, perhaps even Antarctica, can help remind us of our need to sort of wake up, to know and to see the world in which we live as it really is." Thank you.
I like the quote from Eliot there because it made me think about Frankenstein, how the book begins and ends on an ice pack, and how in the early 19th century, the North was greatly romanticized by the English, and I think the reason for that was, and something that gets left out of the equation a lot in our history, I think, maybe too much, is the idea of art as a commodity. I work at the Tyler Museum of Art, and we have a very large collection of Mexican folk art. And whenever we're showing it, I like to remind people that 98% of the art that we see was made with the intention of being sold or putting someone in a position where they can sell other work. I think the idea of commodity comes into play when you mentioned that they're kind of lacking paintings of Antarctic, the early explorations of the Antarctic. But there are a lot of them up north. And I think that might have something to do with that the English were trying to find the Northwest Passage. It would be all of their projects and their moving north was economically driven. I'm wondering if that might be something that could play into why there weren't as many painters getting south, because the idea of everything's driven by economics, like the idea of like westward ho, being driven, the drive west in this country was largely driven by money.
Yeah, that could very well be, because for the Antarctic, there's really no economic incentive ever.
Right.
Really, that's one of the problems that all the explorers were trying to answer is like, what are we even doing down here? Why are we even messing with this place? It's provided little political or economic benefit. And so, yeah, that could very well be a part of it. And another thing related to the Arctic is, so I mentioned at the beginning that Antarctica has no native human culture or anything like that. In the Arctic, we have the Inuits. And so there's something there. There's some sort of background for a human presence there. And also we have, Northern Europe and Russia is very close to the Arctic, and the Scandinavians and so on. The Arctic is a little more relatable for humanity. We've been to Greenland in, the early Middle Ages and so on. And so I think that as well. But the idea of, the economic influence of why there was no painting, I think that's a really good point.
Think about too how like like the English explorers who are heading north,
Yeah.
how they thought about the Inuit or the indigenous peoples. I don't think they saw them as quite as human as as the Europeans.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that aspect is quite as driving as as some of the other things that you
Yeah. Well, but even if it's in sort of a way that we might not really favor today, I mean, we can see this in a lot of Western exploration. There's this kind of like, we kind of make really exotic these other people, even if we don't quite consider them human. And so that still kind of helps to romanticize it, even if in a way we might not really like was done with maybe India, or for instance. You see what I'm saying? But yeah, perhaps you're right, though. I don't know. Yes?
I kind of wanted, you kind of hit on it, I mean, the whole deal of the sublime, the romanticizing of these things, it just kind of reminded me about, like the way the West treated the East and the images that were produced by that, and then of course then sold off as commodities to this exotic land that no one was really familiar with. And then, so you have this landscape that is, you're right, completely barren of humanity, basically. So the fact that we romanticize that, and then kind of take our own, you said kind of take our own spin on it, talking about interconnectivity.
Yeah.
So is this kind of a wholly, like, again, a thing that we've seen in the past about the Western ideology, I guess, about imprinting what we think on something that's barren, that's nothing.
So what are you referring to would be the Western ideology here?
I'm trying to think of, I mean, another question.
Are you saying the fact that we're even like doing stuff like that and making these sort of visions is still kind of like imposing something on it?
Yeah, it's kind of, we're trying to make something of it that maybe it's not.
Yeah,
I guess.
perhaps. Well, yeah, it's interesting. It's, I think it's like, when we think about a natural environment where humans have normally occupied, this thing that we're doing, maybe with like some of the things you're suggesting, like these artworks, it's more ingrained. And with the Antarctic, we're seeing it like happen before our eyes. Here is like a land that means nothing before we get there in some sense. And then we're just seeing humans try to relate to it and make it something that's a part of the human world. And we see how obvious it is that humans are really affecting how we understand this place, whereas other places it's been happening for longer. We have more precedent for doing this sort of thing. I don't know. Any other questions? Yes.
Your passion for your topic and everything, it's contagious. It's wonderful. Thank you for speaking extemporaneously. It's a very rare thing to do in our history. We generally stay very close to our texts, so it's nice to see you see about it. And I admired the breadth of this as a project in some ways, but as an art historian, I feel like I do need to take you to task, maybe in some places. I like how many different directions you went, but I wonder how much more compelling of a project it could be if you really honed in very deeply. So I was struck especially by your modernist reductionism slide. And all the art historians in the room were sort of like, wait a minute, you can't put Duchamp and Mondrian and Kazimir Malevich on the same slide. Those are such important, distinctive movements doing such different things. As a Russian specialist myself, I think you're really onto something with the Malevich. I think this whole thing could have been about white on white and horror vacui, and I mean that movement is about the supremacy of feeling over reason, suprematism. And if you take that all the way to its logical sort of conclusions, Antarctica, the alien world, is the world of feeling over reason. It is the world that you must grapple with perceptually, which is the artistic project, but that you can't ever lock in this way. And the Kandinsky was so interesting too. This business of the perfect quote that you found, this sort of like historian's delight about what he says about white, and white is absence, but white the presence. I almost wish that you had made it more, I heard your brain do that, as much as I liked the breadth that this had.
Okay. So on the modern reductionism slide, that was probably the one I kind of like agonized over the most. I was like, is this like crap? Like, is this like actually true? And so I think I mean, I could very well have been wrong to put that in there. Okay, I am, okay. But there's precedent for this in some of the literature of this idea that, you know, we have this movement in art and that we're seeing Antarctica, and the phrase that's often been used is it's ready-made modern art. And it's specifically in this sense of sort of reductionist art. And I mean, I'm using those examples like, you know, Duchamp and everything in a very, very modest sort of way. I mean, he's not even doing a landscape there. So, I mean, I get that idea, but just, I mean, he's drawing off cubism, different things. Like, this is just kind of the basic impulse in art. And it's just, I think these are, it's to a large degree, to some extent, but there's precedent in the literature at the very least for this, even if it's incorrect. But anyways, thank you.
We think you should have put the urinal, Duchamp's urinal, instead of the nude descending the staircase. It's ready-made, it's white on white.
White, yeah. Everything.
Yeah.
I think there are better examples maybe you could have used. And then, but again, that's a whole argument. Arguing that 20th century modernism as a whole, Dadaism, Gestalt, Suprematism, that all of that is actually about reductionism, that's like a profoundly interesting argument. I hate to see you throw it away. You know what I mean? Did you get that sense?
Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much.